but give us a brief background of yourself and how you kind of came to the point before Team Zed.
Well, I've always enjoyed writing. So even all the way back in high school and earlier than that, I would write short stories. There was a series of short stories I wrote with a couple friends of mine where we all shared characters. And of course, we all were characters in each other's stories, and always enjoyed sort of creating worlds and role playing and things like that. And over time, I drifted away as I went to university and got a real job and things like that. But it was always something that I really wanted to do. And in the process of all of that real life stuff, I was approached by a couple friends of mine before podcasts were really a thing in the general consciousness. They asked if I would be interested in doing one, and I didn't have any clue what that meant. And 12 years later, it's still going, and it was blessed with a small amount of success that led us to making interesting contacts throughout the gaming community and the writing community. And even we actually had a few episodes that were interviews out of Hollywood that were really interesting for me anyway. And in that process, I would speak occasionally about how I enjoyed writing, and I was doing battle reports and still little short stories for friends and things like that. And people who were listening, who we had made contacts with over the course of the first few years of the podcast, then reached out and offered me the opportunity to start writing. So my first real jobs in the gaming industry were working for Spartan Games out of the UK. Neil at Spartan Games was a fan of the show and enjoyed, he had actually come on the show several times. So I was doing mostly Firestorm Armada, so sci-fi space fleet combat fiction. And then I went to his original game, Uncharted Seas. I did a big campaign book for that, which never saw the light of day because they switched from Uncharted Seas and they put their primary focus on other games. So that was my first lesson in the gaming industry. Sometimes you'll do a lot and then some sort of business decision you have nothing to do with will eventually come along and, oops, well, you got paid, but nobody will ever see what you wrote. So that was intriguing. At the same time I was working for them, another friend through the show was working for Fantasy Flight Games, and he was in charge of the 40K role play section of their catalog. And he reached out, and I did a couple of tests for them, sort of like lore knowledge and things like that. And I'd been playing Warhammer 40,000 since Rogue Trader, so like in the late 1980s, early 1990s, to prove myself an old war dog. And I really enjoyed working with them. I did a lot of different books. I was actually able to do the stat lines and the rules for a couple iconic units from 40K, that translating those into role play. But it was mostly mechanics and only a little bit of fluff. And that wasn't really what I wanted to do. And they knew that I was more interested in narratives and stories. So my writing assignments slowly segued in that direction, although I continued to do role playing for them, and actually ended up working on the Star Wars role play also, which was pretty amazing. Again, got to do some stat lines and some backgrounds and some rules for some iconic sort of background, but still pretty famous, like a Quailish and a couple other Star Wars races and things like that were neat. And then the last little bit of my time with Fantasy Flight, they were just starting Rune Wars, which was going to be their attempt at tabletop wargaming. And it was a really neat game. I really enjoyed it. Its fluff was based on the Descent board games, sort of dungeon crawling board games that they had slowly built into a whole world, Tyrannoth. And so that was where they really kind of let me cut loose and do a lot of narrative. So I wasn't working on the rules, I was actually working on the lore, a lot of background fluff pieces for the rule books, and then eventually a novella that sort of worked as a travelogue through Tyrannoth and introduced the reader to all the different locations in their world. And then that sort of got axed because the sales weren't so great. So so while I was working with that and still doing little bits and pieces with Spartan games, a friend of the show, Romeo Philippe, reached out from Battle Foam fame. He reached out. He wanted to start a war game, and that was Wild West Exodus. So I was the chief lore writer for Wild West Exodus. I did a lot of writing on all the different factions, spent hours and hours and hours on phone calls, getting all of the fluff and the background and the lore right so that when I wrote it, it would make sense to them. Lots of little short stories along the way. And then they decided they wanted to have a narrative component to the game as well. And they first wanted to do comic books, and they asked me if I knew anyone who could write comic books. And so a quick Google search and about 30 minutes of reading how-to manuals online, and I called them back and said I did know someone who could write comic books. I could write comic books. So I did a 6 comic book run for them, writing the scripts, working with an amazing artist, Michael Nigro, who I still work with occasionally on book covers and things like that. It was a fantastic experience. I love working with people in that sort of gestalt kind of creative environment. And that was great, but the economics of comic book publication are such that it costs more for a company to publish one comic book than it does for them to publish a novel. And so they decided to segue into novels. And I was like, well, that's where I've always wanted to go. So that at that time, Wing to Sar had come on, working with Outlaw Miniatures, which was the spin-off company that was doing Wild West Exodus. And Vincent, the owner of Wing to Sar, who was also a friend through the show, through the D6 Generation, our podcast, he reached out and said, I'm going to suggest you as the writer for the first novels. I want you to, his first piece of advice ever to me was, I don't want you to be nervous. Writing a novel is like eating an elephant. You have to do it one bite at a time. And I said, I'm not nervous. Let's go. And so the rest is kind of history. I wrote 5 novels in the Wild West Exodus universe. Wild West Exodus passed from Outlaw Miniatures to War Cradle in the UK. War Cradle had also, through some bizarre twist of fate, acquired all of the Spartan Games properties and had decided to tie Wild West Exodus into Dystopian Wars, which was another game that Spartan had started that I had done a lot of not a lot. They didn't do a lot of fiction, Spartan. So what fiction there was, I did most of that. And so I got a chance to tie those 2 properties from the beginning of my working in the gaming industry and the tail end of my working in the gaming industry and tie them all together, which was pretty neat. And then things started to go a little different. Working in the gaming industry, as I said, you're very susceptible to market forces. And so when a game that you're working on no longer is selling, well, that game's not going to be around anymore. So Fantasy Flight gave up the Warhammer 40,000 license when they sort of liquidated their relationship with GW so they could focus on their own miniatures games, which I'm a big fan of that decision because I love Star Wars Legion, their big Star Wars infantry game. But when they did that, every book I ever worked on for Fantasy Flight for Warhammer 40K went away. So that was, you know, probably hundreds of thousands of words worth of work that are now like in my attic in a big giant box. So that's good. But and so I started to feel like working in the gaming industry, although it can be rewarding and it's neat and it's fun, it through no fault of your own, your work can sort of just disappear. And I was talking with Vincent about that, and Vincent had at that point brought on Brandon, his son, who's now my primary editor, and they had both said, why don't you try to write your own book? So I then started writing my own independent books, and I did a sci-fi book with a sequel coming out hopefully in the next year or two. I did a fantasy novel. I did a pirate novel that's coming out later this year that's actually tied in with Firelock Games' Blood and Plunder. And we're creating, Winged Hussar is creating a joint world that other authors can come into. And so I'm in the process of writing, it's a 2-book series of the story that introduces that world to readers so that they'll know what's going on when other authors come in. That's what that came out. Rise of the Alchemist was the last book that just came out. And in the process of editing that, they approached me and said, we know that, you know, you're kind of off writing in the gaming industry, but we just built this new relationship with Corvus Belli, and we know that you've enjoyed Infinity, and we thought, hey, we're going to do 2 books to start off with, and we've already got this really good guy who's already worked on a lot of our Kings of War stuff. He's going to do 1 book. How would you like to do the other? And I said, heck yeah, if there's one game that's going to be around for a while, it's going to be Infinity. And here we are with Team Zed, shell game.
Perfect transition. I mean, what can you tell us about Team Zed's shell game without giving too much away?
Without giving too much away, Team Zed is, as it suggests, it's about they're not the cream of the crop. I always approach books, whether it's for games or just out of my own imagination. I approach it from the character point of view, from the people, and then the sort of the events and the battles and whatnot stems from their struggles. And I've always been more interested in flawed characters, people who have, you know, people who you can identify with. And I've also been fascinated with the idea of how little most of us know about what's really going on in the world around us, and how even more so that impacts soldiers and, you know, police officers, like people who are really in the thick of the action, but don't have the 30,000 foot view of what's going on, and how much of history has turned on the actions of these people who were just doing their best in these really difficult moments without really knowing the wider idea. So I came up with sort of a human sphere-wide crisis that might happen that would fly under the radar of most, you know, military action-oriented storytelling, but at the same time could really have a massive impact. And what might have caused that, and then how those ripples might then catch smaller fish in their net, so to speak. And Team Zed is that. They're the smaller fish. They are a group of has-beens and wannabes and washed up. One is a drug addict. Just people who just haven't been able to put things together and make things work for themselves. They're brought together by a guy who's being held back from his ambitions because of some bureaucratic nonsense that he had, you know, nothing to do with. somebody took umbrage at something his father did in the past, and they're just sort of putting roadblocks in his place. And so they've got a plan, and their plan has nothing to do with grandiose schemes or human sphere wide issues. They're going to make a name for themselves and parlay that name into whatever success means for each of them. And so each one of them is offered an opportunity, and they go off on their first job, and things immediately, of course, don't go well. And meanwhile, there's this huge thing that's going on in the human sphere, and two well-placed agents of Aleph are caught in that and tasked with switching from one very complex, very important job to the AI to this new task to try to figure out what's going on and stop things from unraveling, because things are really unraveling. The book takes place right at the bleeding edge of the current fluff. So the combined army has just restarted its assault. It's now attacked Concilium Prima, and all of the human spheres trying to come together in this really essential moment to stop the alien invasion. And so that's under threat. So Aleph is, as Aleph does, trying to minimize the impact of human stupidity and try to, keep things tight enough that we can fight off the aliens. And these two teams then sort of collide as their two trajectories both go off the rails at the same time. And the book then traces, without giving too much away, the remnants of both teams as they try to combine their goals and solve this problem and this mystery of what's going on with the greater crisis that's arisen.
Team Zed shell game focuses mostly on nomads. What drew you towards them being the faction behind the story?
Well, I'm a big fan of writing what you know, and I went to a military college, but that's the extent of my military experience. So I've written military characters. I know the military fairly well through observation and friends. But I know misfits way better than I know the military. And my own interest in Infinity sort of revolves around that aspect also. I started way back in 3rd edition with Ariadna until I realized that, and I got all the models and I painted them up and I really enjoyed that part of it. I played casually with some friends and I really enjoyed that part of it. But as my play started to expand out into a wider player group, I realized that, I don't have any of this hacking that you speak of. And I don't have this heavy armor. Oh, great. Yeah, I have a werewolf, but you know what? You can just shoot him up with whatever, So I was sort of disillusioned with my choices, and then immediately went to, well, I still want the whole misfit aspect. Oh, look at the nomads. And so I've been interested in nomads for a long time, and I'm very intrigued by their background, by the rich history of their, not only the nomad nations, but the fact that it breaks down into 3 very clean, sort of sub factions. And I really enjoyed that whole space, the space-based aspect of the nomads. So also my tendency to tell stories about more flawed characters, more sort of relatable characters and misfits sort of fits right in there with the nomads, who are all misfits. So it really kind of lent itself to that kind of storytelling. How
much direction did Corvus Belli give you as to the story that you were to tell about Infinity?
Well, Corvus Belli has been awesome. They've probably been my favorite company to work with. They didn't give a lot of direction as far as the opening process. What happens is Mark and I, working sort of in parallel, we both submitted some concepts and some ideas for stories. and Gutierre, who's in charge of the sort of the fluff of the Infinity world at Corvus Belli, would respond with, well, that would work, this, and his feedback is just awesome, because he never just says no. He's actually like a really good dungeon master. He always says, he says, well, maybe not this, but how about that? Or yes, but there's one of the best pieces of advice I've ever had for dungeon mastering was never say no, always say yes, but. You know, can I fly? Yes, but you'll probably fall 3 feet after you jump up, you know. And Gutierre, that's really what his approach has been. Well, so this idea doesn't make sense, but this would make sense if you did this instead. And so he really kind of helped me shape the core idea, the concept of the sort of the sphere-wide issue that I imagined, and then the impact that would have on. He really helped me a lot with how could there possibly be agents of Aleph in the Nomad nations where they're actually not allowed to go. How would they be interacting with, you know, Arachne, the data net that the Nomads use, as opposed to Maya, which is the sphere-wide data net that the rest of the humans use, which is where Aleph is housed, and all of the aspects and the agents, you know, are used to swimming through unlimited data. It's like, you know, going into a cheap data plan. And I mean, so the story itself, they were very open to, and it was more a case of helping me fine-tune the aspects of the story so that they would mesh more cleanly with the existing lore, really.
One of the things I found fascinating about the first few chapters was you go into the granularity of what it's like living in the human sphere, you know, from the bars, the things they're eating, how they're drinking. How did you do that, bearing in mind a lot of the existing Corvus Belli fluff doesn't necessarily go into that specificity?
I think there's a lot of things about human nature and human life that aren't going to change so much. And there's just, I mean, I think there's always going to be bars. There's always going to be drinking. There's always going to be drugs, although in my book, I've actually created a new concept of drug, which is, I don't think I created it. It's probably came from Snow Crash or some other cyberpunk book I read like 100 years ago, where it's actually you're plugging a program directly into your neural network, and it spirals you up, and then limits itself, and then eventually drops you out of it again. But there's always going to be, people are going to be looking for outlets. As far as existing lore goes, I loved your interview with Mark, by the way, the Mark Barber, the other author, and as he said, we were flooded with background. So we were literally given digital files of every piece of writing that's ever been done for Infinity. So every role-playing book, every pamphlet that comes with the 2-team starter sets that they sell, you know, every year they do 1 or 2 of those, and every one of those comes with short stories and fluff. We were given everything you could possibly imagine. It was daunting. At first, I swore several times, and I was like, I'm not reading 3,000 pages of, maybe this was a job I shouldn't have taken. I don't know. But once I came to grips with the fact that was another reason, I'm like, oh, Nomads has so much different stuff in it that if I focus on Nomads, I don't have to focus on all this other stuff. So immediately 300 pages of one role-playing book, I only have to focus on 50 pages. So it was sort of self-limiting and for my own sanity. And there's a lot of background, believe it or not, about what people are drinking and where they're going and things like that. And at the same time, I'm a big fan of sort of hard sci-fi. I really enjoy, well, it became less hard sci-fi, but the whole The Expanse, that's not what the book series is called, but the TV series The Expanse, the books that those are based on are some of my favorites. And so a lot of the Belter food, I thought, well, that makes sense that they would need to have something that would be reconstituted. It would be something that would be relatively easy to store. And what would you do to make that kind of food a little more palatable to a human being who doesn't just want to like drink slop? And so I added, that's where a lot of the description of the foods come from. The drinks. Another thing Gutierrez was awesome with was helping me differentiate the three motherships, right? So you have Tunguska, who that was basically gangsters, banksters, and and hackers, and they built that up. So that's kind of a criminal syndicate. There are places that are very comfortable on Tunguska. There's also, really seedy dives. And then Corregidor, which used to be a prison ship, and that's where all the manual laborers are. Corregidor, one piece of trivia that I stumbled upon somewhere that I really enjoyed was that Corregidor has nothing to do with comfort, and it's a law on Corregidor that there needs to be crash couches interspersed throughout the ship, because they never can tell if they're going to have to go into a hard burn all of a sudden, and everybody's going to need to sit down. So that actually came across, the initial draft was done when I found that piece of information and was really intrigued by it. And I went back and rewrote entire sections of the book to change all of the descriptions of furniture and whatnot when they're on Corregidor to reflect that sort of hard and nasty crash couches everywhere, grav chairs everywhere, and how uncomfortable that would be you don't have just a regular chair you can sit in. So there's the universe of Infinity, as all of the fans know, is already so rich that you could be daunted by how much is already out there, or you could try to just sort of dip into it and kind of just flavor the story, the narrative, with these pieces of already existing information that'll really, with just a sentence or two, you can introduce the concepts to readers who might not know that. But people who are like real true believers and they've read every word that's already come out, they're going to be like, oh yeah, because, there's that law that was passed in, whatever year it was. And so I really just kind of like, yeah, I guess to answer your question, I tried to make it a relatable experience, but at the same time, touch on as many different pieces of existing lore as I could.
This is quite tricky because I've got avenues I want to go down as a fan, and then avenues that I need to go down just so that everyone else kind of gets a sense as to what's going on. One question I have to ask is, if you were to say the type of Infinity player this novel was written for, would it be more the beginner or someone who is already a fan of the lore and wants to see that expressed in more detail?
I would hope, my goal going into this would be that I could appeal to both. I tried to include enough touchstones at the beginning to explain what was going on without just, dumping all the information on somebody so that they would get it. But at the same time, not belabor points to the point where someone who already knows the fluff is like, yeah, I got it. Get on with the story. So I tried to do it organically. As every Infinity fan knows, many of their rule books and their pamphlets and whatnot start with with sort of like a digest of Maya stories. And so I thought, why recreate the wheel? And so that's how I introduced the concept of the Nomads, the concept of the Krug, which is the three Nomad motherships. Bakunin, I didn't mention Bakunin when I was talking about the other motherships. Bakunin is like the Bohemians. and the black market awful human experimenters and whatnot. So sort of an interesting mix there as well, which is like really the Nomads in a nutshell. But anyway, all three motherships are independent throughout the human sphere, and then once every 4 years they come together for what they call a krug, which is, or a krug, which sounds cooler than krug. I know how to spell it all. I don't know how to pronounce any of it. Yeah, it's that's science fiction, you know, and fantasy. They all come together in this big sort of a festival and restructuring of negotiated contracts and all sorts of interest. It's like Mardi Gras rolled into, you know, the stock market opening and whatnot. So I have all of those concepts introduced, but I have also introduced the larger conflict that's happening through the inner sphere. See, I'm going to go back in a battle tech, and whenever I say inner sphere, I mean human sphere. The larger conflict that's taking, or the crisis that's taking place in the human sphere is introduced in that digest also, and it's never really touched on outside of background news reports that you hear occasionally, and the agents of Aleph were the only ones in the book who really know what's going on as much as anybody does, because no one really knows what's going on until the end. That's where you get what's going on. So what I've tried to do is introduce all of the core concepts of the Infinity Universe between the digest and then incidental dialogue among the characters, so that a veteran would be like, oh, that's cool, yeah, I remember that, and move on with the story. And a newcomer into the series, into the storyline, would have enough information that it makes sense, really, is the goal. I don't want anybody to either be bored or to be confused and left floating.
I must admit, I personally loved those breakdowns at the very, very first chapter. But one of the things I'm curious about is writing in space. I mean, you've mentioned that you're covering all three of the Nomad motherships. They live in space. That has separate rules for how science and people interact. How do you tackle the challenges that come from writing science fiction that's in space instead of gravity-based, planet-based science fiction like Mark's kind of covered?
I didn't really. The gravity is taken care of by I don't know. It could be momentum. It could be the ships. You know, they're moving. It could be. I believe they have artificial gravity. But at the same time, especially on Corregidor, they're constantly aware that anything might go out at any moment, and that's. Gutierrez was also great with me, and that was one of the really nice positive notes that I received from him, was how ugly I made Corregidor, because a pet peeve of his is people who romanticize the Nomads, in particular Corregidor, and he just wants everybody to know that that is not some place you would ever want to live. And so I have everybody drinking out of vacuum sealed bulbs, so that if all of a sudden you lose the gravity, it's not going to make a big giant mess. I have in particular, their food is very, very basic. Drinking in each of the three motherships is slightly different. In Tunguska, you might as well be on Earth. They're just drinking out of glasses and whatnot. In Corregidor, they're drinking out of vacuum-sealed bulbs, so if they lose gravity, you know, they're used to it. And it's also the lights are constantly flickering in Tunguska. The gravity does fluctuate as you're walking around, because it's kind of jury-rigged. It used to be a prison, so you're talking about decades now of fixes and repairs, and occasionally a work crew will just get bored and change something for the fun of it. And then in Bakunin, it's more sort of techno bohemian, and God knows what you're gonna, God knows how the alcohol is going to get into your bloodstream, but it's going to be interesting one way or the other. And so one thing I always do with my writing is I try to avoid things that my characters wouldn't know about or be aware of. And so so for instance, when I was writing the pirate book that's coming out later this year, if it wasn't the captain or the navigator, they weren't worried about how to say it, they weren't worried about the technical specifications of what was going on. So with this, my characters are so, sort of fundamentally low level. They're not really worried too much. They know, well, there's a chance the gravity's going to cut out, and then you got to run for it, float for a chair and worry about the bulbs later. So it's kind of like I try to write from their point of view and keep in mind, and I'm sure, every now and then something will slip and I won't cover something quite the way they would, but I'm trying to see it from their point of view, while at the same time explaining enough that people can follow along and get a sense. I'm really big on fig leaves. If I'm not going to cover it, I want to at least mention it in a sentence or two so you can go, oh, okay, oh, momentum, oh, got it. Oh, physics, yeah, that still exists.
I really want to touch upon characters because you've mentioned it as being a key part of your writing process, and reading through it, the characters are just so rich. For the seasoned players, is it entirely new characters, or are they going to be characters that they've heard of, know of through the game already?
Most of them are new characters. All of the core characters are new. Although I was offered the opportunity early in the process to include, if you want to mention people who already exist, feel free. And I started with now I'm gonna forget, and he's not in my notes, I don't think. The way I write, I just have like these, I do character cards almost like it's a role-playing game. Yeah, and I don't have them.
That's so good.
I started with, he works for O12. He's got a very intriguing name. He's a jetpack guy.
Cuervo Goldstein.
Cuervo Goldstein. So I wanted him to show up towards the end and kind of be like sort of a wrap-up mechanic for the book. But then as the story started to unfold and I realized I had to go into areas I hadn't thought about, I knew that I was going to have to start dealing with hackers. And I thought, well, that's my opportunity there. So I have Valeria Gromaz and Mary Problems and Jazz Katakovas. They all make an appearance. Actually, they're pretty big players in a few chapters. Detective Inspector Jelena Kovac is almost like a ghostly presence through most of the book as she is shadowing the aspects of Aleph as they're trying to do their job. And all of that sort of comes to a head in the final chapters of the book. So there are characters that Nomad players will be, or O12 player. And then there's a couple mentions of Perseus, who's a rogue Aleph aspect who broke off from the AI and now lives, a playboy wanderer life through the nomads and through the human sphere. You never meet him. Spoiler alert. Oh well, you never meet him, but there's one of the aspects of Aleph who's sort of fascinated by him, and kind of like you find out later on why. And so there's a lot of touchstones for those characters, and then you do meet a few of them. Mostly not in the flesh, but I won't elaborate on that.
Interestingly, one of the characters from Downfall ended up getting a profile in the game.
Yes.
Have you had is that likely to happen? Are you able to say?
Mark was very lucky in that the story that he told featured a faction, Pano, that was getting sort of revised at that time. And so they in the revision process for Pano, they were very happy to sort of incorporate his main character into that process, and so he got some stats. And when I inquired, they're not currently doing that for the Nomads, so there won't be a character from the book in the game, although they reserved the right to do that in the future, which would be neat. However, because my characters are so low level, as far as the game goes, you could recreate Team Zed literally out of the regular roster and probably be better off than the real Team Zed is.
That sounds perfect. I know Nomads have had a bit of a focus with, their new action pack with Crimson Stone. So this is actually really well timed. Was it just coincidental, or was it a case of Crimson Stone is coming, Corregidor's getting a bit of a focus, let's get Team Zed shell game out there?
The timing of the publication is just pure luck. I'm trying to think. At the very beginning, when I write for game companies, I do try to solicit their ideas at the beginning, and before I come up with any preconceived notion of what I want to write, because my imagination is going to spark off of almost anything, I sort of engage them in like, is there anything you would like my imagination to spark off of when as we're beginning? And I do think at one point they mentioned that Nomads was coming up, and I think that either came up later as a wow, this is pure luck and coincidence, or it was at the beginning. But there was some thought behind the fact that there would be a focus in the near future on the Nomads, whether it's serendipity or it was a little more pre-planned. I can't remember.
Was there anything that Corpus Belli said, just steer clear of that? No, we don't really want you going down that path with this novel?
Not like story-wise, but there were several things where the pushback was more in line with, well, that wouldn't happen that way. So, and like I said, there's a word, and it's completely escaped me, which is horrific given the topic of this interview. But working together with a group of people, it's been a phenomenal experience, and in no small part because there hasn't been don't do that, or well, that doesn't make sense, period. It was quite often don't do that this way, but here's 3 different options that you might use that would do the same thing. And so right at the beginning, the major crisis that I wanted to introduce was perfectly okay because it was so sort of esoteric that it's the kind of thing that most militaries wouldn't even be aware of. If it was happening, it would be something that the civilian side would be much more concerned with. So there wasn't any pushback on that. It was mainly it was Gutierre and the others helping me shape a scenario that would have, like I said a little while ago, the Aleph agents working in Nomad territory, which is something that the Nomads are constantly working against. They've got entire sections of their military whose only job is to keep Aleph out of their data net. And so the fact that I have these 2 guys running rampant through the all 3 motherships, and dipping into Arachne on a fairly regular basis, was a lot of kind of fine tuning and go slightly more in this direction or that direction. But there wasn't any like, don't talk about this.
That was just so good, because again, I hadn't really even clicked that just like bringing Aleph into the Nomads territory would be so like the antithesis of everything that happens. How you navigate it would have been mind-boggling.
I think that alone is the main thing I would be most thankful for Gutierre and the others to work with me on, because that was sort of the core of my once I started building this idea, it really needed to be them. It needed to be 2 guys from Aleph working in the Nomad environment, and to tell the story that I wanted to tell in the way I wanted to tell it, it only worked that way. And so them working with me and coming up with how that might work, and what that might look like was really key to making the whole thing work.
Is there anything from the game itself that came into the novel, or did you steer clear from that and just treat it separately?
Well, I think I like to think that most if the game is good, then a narrative would build off, cinematic narrative builds off of that usually, and it's not really going to the, nary the twain shall meet sort of thing, where you're not going to be going, oh, that guy just rolled a 1, or oh, he rolled a 12, but the other guy rolled a 13, so the sort of the esoteric minutia of the conflicting die rolls and whatnot. But at the same time, I did want to focus the action scenes in a way that would seem like a seasoned Infinity player would go, oh yeah, that guy just got all the activations this turn. Kind of like to give everybody sort of a heroic moment where everybody else is sort of like, uh-oh, and one guy just steps in, or one girl, or one mutant steps in. Not a mutant. Mutant's a bad word. Mutant is a judgmental term that only a bigot would use. That was another interesting conversation, because they were like, mutant isn't the way you would refer to that person. And I came back with, oh, but it is if you're a bigot. And so if this character is a bigot, oh yeah, okay. So everybody else is using the correct term, but this one person is saying mutant. Yeah, so that's what that was. But yeah, so I did try to, because that's probably the most intriguing game mechanic to me, is that idea that, to push ahead, everybody's going to have their own activation. But in a moment of crisis, everybody, I still can't really wrap my head around what's going on in the real world to create that moment. But that when that one really powerful piece can use everybody's activation and go all out, it does create heroic cinematic moments, and I wanted to have a few of those in there. So hopefully a seasoned player will recognize those moments when they come up.
There's more of a move into gaming in general, but specifically wargaming, getting more content created around it in terms of fiction and novels. Halo's got the TV series, Warcraft's had a film, even in gaming, Warhammer 40k continues to increase in popularity. Do you think novellas are essential to the gaming industry at present?
Absolutely, and they should all come to me to write. No, that's a great question. That's an awesome question. I would like to think so, but as you know, and everyone listening knows, gamers come in all different shapes and sizes and flavors, and I am a fluff guy. I love the fluff. I love background. I love the stories. I read the stories. And I know that there are many of us, but there's also the rules guys who they like skip over the fluff and they're never going to buy a book. And so I think to well serve a well-rounded gaming community, absolutely you want to get as much out there as possible. And I think there's probably more people interested in the background and the stories and the narratives than not. So to really tie it together, I get a little frustrated, to be honest, which doesn't make any intellectual sense. But when I'm playing a game, or I get into a game and there isn't more fluff and there isn't more background, I almost get a little resentful. I'm like, yeah, I can do it myself, but where's your stuff? Show your work, So I think that's a great point. And I don't know if the Halo TV show is like, them trying to get more gamers in, or them just trying to cash in more. I'm there no matter what. I'm enjoying the show. Any sci-fi fantasy, I'm going to give a shot. And a lot of the stuff that's coming out right now is great. But I think any game company that wants to really make an impression has to have some effort put into that narrative and that story. And the more that they do that, and the richer their background, I think the more gamers and the more different types of, if you have a strong rule set, you're going to pull in those guys, you know, those guys and girls, but maybe not so much if there's no story to it. If you've got the story but the rules stink, that's going to die, because even the story-based people are going to be like, well, but the game's no fun. But if you've got both together, I think you really kind of I think that's also sort of a lightning in a bottle scenario. And I'm really excited for Corvus Belli to reach this point, because I think, well, I don't think I know, because I have it all on my computer right now. There's so many millions, literally millions of words already dedicated to this game and its background and its universe, that starting more coherent stories that you don't have to, like, you know, read 4 different pamphlets to get the overall arching story. I think that's really a really neat place for a game company to be that wants to kind of kick it to the next level. And I think my short answer is yes. I think if you really want to be up there with the big boys, you need to have stories that people can easily access, and like sort of in one purchase, get a story that delves deeper into that world.
You've written the first novel about nomads specifically. Have you brought anything surprising or new about the faction to the front of mind that maybe wasn't known before?
I don't think so. Only because I focused again on such, you know, the basic level of none of my characters have a well, there's one Daktari field medic who has experience in the Nomad military forces, and no one else does. So there's really, I mean, maybe sort of that sense of independence. From a game point of view, no. From a culture perspective, I would think yes, because the core characters are all from Corregidor, so most of the cultural stuff comes from there. And the idea that you know, when you're playing the game, that your people on the table literally have to pay for oxygen, right? Or have to do volunteer work to vote, might be intriguing to people, and might be like, oh yeah, you know, these are like, you know, rugged individualists we're talking about here. So I think sort of a more three-dimensional view of the you get an overview of the banksters of Tunguska, and you get sort of a jaded exterior perspective of the Bohemians of Bakunin, because the characters that I'm focusing on primarily are from Corregidor, which is, you know, the working class of the nomads, basically. And one of them is got a very jaded view of everything, really. And my favorite phrase that I came across in all my research through the lore was hippie love money, which is how some people on Corregidor refer to the social credit system used on Bakunin. And just the idea that your purchasing power might relate to, you know, how happy and friendly you are with your neighbors, I think it really kind of keys into a certain kind of person who would like that, and a certain kind of person who would find that entirely alien and just confusing. And hippie love money as a phrase is just trips off the tongue. And so I knew that was going to have to make at least one appearance in the book. And I knew exactly who was going to say it.
You mentioned that the timeline for Team Zed's shell game is pretty much N4. You know, it's the it's the combined armies attack on Concilium Prima. Is this another perspective on that same event? Does it move the timeline forward slightly? You know, how does it sit in terms of that timeline milestone?
It takes place, I would say, mere weeks or months after the assault that the sort of cross sphere assault that the attack on Concilium Prima is a part of, right? So it's this new renewed assault on the whole human sphere. And in that moment of cultural fragility of Pearl Harbor Part 2, so to speak, that's when this is occurring.
Is it primarily Nomads and Aleph? Those are the only two that we see?
There's a lot of mention of O12, mainly because, as you might imagine, if you're an agent, O12 also is not allowed to operate inside Nomad space, but they would be slightly more tolerated than agents of Aleph. So if you're an agent of Aleph and people start to get suspicious of you, you may fall back on, oh, I work for O12. And so O12 sort of gets pulled in extraneously through that. And then at the end, Aleph, trying to tie everything up with a nice bow, might send in, I don't know, let's say a jump trooper who is on leave from other duties and wants to intimidate people into the scenario to try to extract people, whether or not that's successful, who knows. So yeah, there's some mention of O12, but it focuses primarily on the Nomads and Aleph. Yeah, that was the steepest learning curve for me, was the quantronic digital data sphere reality of infinity.
Is that the most surprising thing that you uncovered as you were writing this novel?
It probably was, mainly because I there's a lot of delving into, well, there's no delving into Maya except in memory, right? Because there is no Maya out in the Nomad ships. That network is not allowed, right? There's limited contact with that network, but it in general, you're not going to be swimming through the depths of Maya in Corregidor or Tunguska or Bakunin. But working in Arachne, I was able to I found all the information available. The fascinating concept of building an illogical data net that's literally designed to drive AIs insane because it doesn't follow any logical structure. It's built on a structure of myth and legend and soaring Gothic architecture, whatever that means in a cybernetic world, and sort of translating that into a first-person experience for several of the characters at different points in the book have to become fully immersed in Arachne and sort of experience it firsthand. And I was very nervous about doing that because there's very little of that that's been out there. And I was very excited when Gutierre was like, nope, that's all good. And then I was a little crestfallen when he said, everyone experiences Arachne and Maya in a completely subjective sense. So whatever you write is going to be fun. I was like, oh, I thought I nailed it. But it was fun. It's fun also sort of playing with the idea of consciousness and the idea of the idea of the digital patina that overlays your vision and sort of creates an augmented reality around you. If you're in a fully servicing data net like Maya, versus what that would be like if that's what you're used to, and all of a sudden you're in the Nomad motherships where that's not available, and what a Nomad would think about that, where literally, oh, sure, like you said, you want that guy to look like a rabbit whenever you look at him, and now he looks like a rabbit, but that means someone else, aka Aleph, has decided how to make that guy look like a rabbit. And what if Aleph wants that guy to look like something else? Or maybe it's not a guy, maybe it's a giant killer robot coming to kill you, and it looks like a rabbit because, so there's a lot of back and forth culturally on what it means to sort of give up that sense of agency in interacting with your surroundings and the world around you when you sort of surrender to that digital patina of the augmented reality, which I think is something that you really could only, I mean, maybe Ariadna a little bit would also feel the same way, but it's definitely a Nomad mindset for sure.
If someone hasn't played Nomads, doesn't really know much about them, with you expanding on their fiction, do you think that people are going to like them more or less as a result of reading Team Zed shell game?
Although they're not all likable, there's I would hope that there's enough to sort of hang your hat on if you're looking for an emotional connection to a faction. They're plucky, you know, they're looking out for number one for sure, but at the same time they have a sense of fair play. All of the Detective Inspector Kovac is definitely a strong character. She's not somebody you want to mess with, but at the same time, you know, she's trying to do a job. She's trying to keep her people safe. The hackers are all the in-game actual figure model hackers they've each got their own unique individual personality. So I feel like you would come away hopefully with a sense of the individuality as opposed to sort of the faceless masses of, you know, super soldier, you know, special forces that most of the other factions seem to have at a distance. I know once you delve into every faction, if they're designed well, which all of them are, there's individuality and there's character and, you know, and there's color. But I think the Nomads sort of kick that up a notch. And I hope that that's carried through in the book.
Too early to ask whether there's a sequel or a follow-up in the works?
Yeah, I mean, that's always a hope. I did write it with the sort of a framework that there can certainly be more Team Zed adventures in the future, or the remnants of Team Zed. You know, and you could plug and play with various characters. But again, yeah, I mean, that all depends on demand, right? So hopefully I've written a story that speaks to, you know, a wide range of Infinity players and maybe people who are only starting to find Infinity. And if there is interest and demand, then I'm certain that there will be follow-up books, because I know Wing Tassar and Corvus Belli intend for this to be an ongoing endeavor. And I'm sure they'll be bringing in other writers, and you want to have as many different writers as possible. If you're doing a full court press on, you know, your fiction, you want to have as many different books from different perspectives and different, you know, writing styles, so you can catch as many different interests and reader types as there are out there. But I would love to revisit this world again and these characters. Like I said, this has been my favorite experience working with a game company, and so I would be honored to do it again if I'm given half a chance.
The release, is it print release only? Will there be digital versions and, you know, even an audiobook?
My hope would be that all three, the digital and the print, usually are available roughly around the same time. Maybe the print comes out a little bit earlier than the digital. Digital is always the easiest for them to release, right? They've got the files, and then I'm pretty sure you're 5 or 6 keystrokes away from, you know, popping up on Amazon and Barnes and Noble and Wing Tassar website and Corvus Belli. The print books, that schedule is a little more difficult to pinpoint. We are in the final process of editing right now. So I literally yesterday there's 24 chapters total if you count the prologue and the epilogue. And I got chapter 19 back from Gutierre yesterday and went over it. And as I've been saying all along, his feedback is great. thank God I chose to predominantly swear in Spanish, because they have been awesome in correcting my colloquialisms. I have some characters who speak a lot of Swahili, and I have one character who drops an occasional Eastern Europe. I can't even remember the language that he speaks at the moment. But you'd be fascinated to find out how many websites there are dedicated to swearing in a variety of languages. And unfortunately, apparently the website I found for Spanish was either outdated or it was very flowery and poetic, because I kept getting notes back. No one would ever say this in real life. And like big giant laughing emojis. One, I can't even remember the phrase that caused this to happen, but apparently it gave great amusement to the entire Corvus Belli office. And then Gutierrez said, I have a friend in Mexico and I passed this along to him as well. He thought it was a real facepalm moment. I was like, okay, good. I hope we're laughing with me and not necessarily. But it's been a great experience. And so right now, towards the, which is great because we're ramping up to the climax of the book. And I'm very nervous that I'm going to have written something that's going to end up with a, nope, this could never happen. You have to go back and rewrite the whole thing. So far, nothing even remotely like that has happened. Most of it's been like, this is hilarious, but that's not what somebody would actually say. Occasionally, I forgot the upside down exclamation point at the beginning of an exclamation, things like that. But the assistance with the Spanish swearing has been phenomenal. So that just jumped out of my head, because that was the primary. Chapter 19 was primarily the last Spanish speaking Mara gangster has been tracked down and is spitting venom, and apparently the venom wasn't quite as colloquial as I thought it was. So yeah, so there's that. So I'm not exactly sure, to go back to the question, when the book is going to be finalized. Basically, Gutierrez has the whole book, and he sends me chapters as he finishes them. I review those chapters, and then I have a running list of notes. For instance, I wrote the O12 throughout the book, and apparently it's not the O12, it's just O12. That was a little syntactic thing that I missed in all of my research. So I have a sort of a find replace list that I have to do as I go through. And then I go through this, and the version that they got was sort of like a second or third draft. Then I get his notes back. I go over his notes. I address them, which is mostly absolutely, sir. Yes, sir. Of course, sir. But occasionally will be, but can he call her a mutant if he's the only one and he's a bigot? So, and that's usually the response there is, oh yes, of course, that works. And a little back and forth sometimes with, like, this wouldn't be this way, but it could be that way. Oh, but how about this way? Oh, but mostly it's just like, yes, sir, absolutely. And they've been very, very minor. And then I'll go through, I'm actually just sent the first half of the book completely finished to Brandon to be edited for, typos and grammar. And he reads it. And he doesn't know anything about Infinity, so he's going to be reading it with fresh eyes. And if I've taken something for granted, or I've missed something, or something doesn't make sense, he's great at pinpointing those things so that I can go in and elaborate and maybe add a couple more sentences that would give the context needed to understand it. So that process, I should have the rest of the book sent to Brandon by the end of the week. He said he's like, there's one book ahead of me in the editing queue, which would mean they're hoping a June release is what's been bandied about. And I wouldn't be surprised, given still the way the world is working, if that might get pushed to July. But it's definitely all along has been has been the hoped for release is it's been a summer release. So June or July would definitely be the big hope for print and digital. Audiobook would take a little bit longer, and audiobook also generally depends on the early sales. If there's an interest in the audiobook, is a long, expensive process, and so you wouldn't do that for a book that sort of turns out to have a niche market more than a more general interest. So that would sort of be, that's a decision that Vince and Brandon would make, I would think, a little bit later once they see numbers start to come in.
If people wanted to follow you for your other works, just general social media, where can people find you online?
I have a website that I just started that I'm trying to keep up to date. That's thegallantscribe.com. And I am on Twitter at D6GCraig. And I don't tweet that often, but when I do, it's almost always gaming, or actually it's always, I don't tweet anything but gaming or writing oriented stuff. And I've been told by Vince and Brandon and Mark that I need a Facebook page, but I don't have one yet. Actually, I think technically I do, but my wife is working on it, and it hasn't been opened to me or the public yet. So eventually there might be one of those. If you are looking on Twitter or the website, when the Facebook page pops up, I'm sure I'll mention that there.
Do you still play Infinity? Would you play again?
Interesting point. I love the universe, and I really like the game. Like I said earlier, the first time I got into it was like 2nd edition into 3rd edition, and I loved playing with my close friends. But as soon as I got out of that little close, like, oh, we all know each other and we know what our teams can do, I felt like I was playing 5 or 6 different games all at the same time. And, oh, there's the Deep Strike game, and, oh, there's the hacking game, and, oh, there's this game and that. And it got really complicated for me. And I will still play it occasionally with 1 or 2 of my closest friends that we all play at the same level. And then when Code 1 came out, I got super excited because that is, of course, the simplified version of Infinity. So I actually have 4 fully fleshed out forces for Code 1. Nomads obviously just came out a little while ago. I don't have them yet, but I will. And I have an entire table of terrain that I can build a city, a big city board specifically for Code 1. I don't play as often as I'd like, but I do play occasionally, and I enjoy very much the game at that sort of simplistic level for old people like me whose brains have started to go smooth and soft.
I think one of the key things that surprised me, I've not gotten into Nomads massively, but I was absolutely enthralled by the book. Like the writing style, the characters, everything. Is there anything that you would like to say about the book or the project as a whole in closing?
Only that I've really, really enjoyed it. I've really I try to fall in love with all of my characters, so they all get an equal amount of my attention. I have my favorites, as any parent would, if you put them under truth serum. No, that's not true. We love all of our children equally. These are the things I can get away with saying because I have an only child. But I've loved my time in the Infinity Universe. It was daunting and terrifying at the beginning. The experience of working with Gutierrez and the Corvus Belli team has been phenomenal. It's really just been a positive experience, top to bottom. I would like I said, I would be honored to be able to do this again with them. And I hope that there's, I try to put a little bit of sort of real world spin on what's going on. And I hope maybe some of that, like, I'm not heavy handed in it, I would hope, but there's a little bit of that, who's choosing what you see through your own eyes kind of, that I really enjoyed playing with. And I liked that a lot, being able to do that, which was only possible because of the quantronic reality of the Infinity universe. And so, yeah, I would just say I loved it. I hope people can sort of sense that and appreciate that. And I hope I get to do it again.